Continues.
We welcome back Sebastian Gorka, former deputy assistant to President Trump and former national security advisor to the president, also a Fox News contributor and best-selling author. Good Sunday morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Let me begin with foreign policy. If you were to, in a phrase or a sentence, outline the president's doctrine in foreign policy, what would it include?
There's an informal version and there's a more formal one. Let's start with the formal one. America first, but not America alone. And the more informal one that I used when I was in the White House, well, let me say, it's not an accident that we have lots of senior Marines in the administration. And in fact, 3 of those Marines, the chairman, the chief of staff of the president, and the Secretary of Defense, not only are Marines, they come from the same Marine Corps division. And that Marine Corps division has a motto, which is no better friend, no worse enemy. And I think that's a pretty good, if you want a bumper sticker for foreign policy under the Trump administration, it's a reassertion of American leadership. It's not isolationism. This must be understood. He's not an interventionist in the neoconservative Bush mold, nor is he an isolationist in the Rand Paul mode. He understands that in a globalized world, there are threats 8,000 miles away that can come and hurt us here, but he doesn't see intervention in the terms of invasion and occupation as a way to solve those. So it's a happy middle ground between what we've seen in the last few years.
Our alliances with our closest neighbors to Canada, also to Great Britain, to Europe, and to Japan, where are they today?
I think if you look at, let's look at the most important ones to begin with. Let's look at NATO, created right after World War II, 1949. This is an alliance that was in trouble for more than 2 decades. Why? Because the concept of the so-called peace dividend in the 1990s led to a free rider syndrome. Far too many of our allies had profited from 40 years of America vouchsafing their future with the Article 5 guarantee of the Washington Treaty that said we would come to their aid should there be an invasion. And as such, they didn't take defense seriously, and they didn't actually spend enough on defense as they had agreed to do so. What did the president do? He made it very clear during his campaign for the presidency that NATO needs to step up to the plate. If you are serious about this being a collective defense organization, you've got to pay for it. You can't be a member of a club and then not pay your membership dues. That sent a very clear message. And what happened? Once he became commander-in-chief, within a matter of months, you have the Secretary General of NATO in the East Room of the White House saying 2% of GDP, absolutely, Mr. President. So this is why, it's the art of the deal to make people understand there is a new commander-in-chief. If you want to be serious, please step up to the plate. But there's a deeper message. And I tell people, if you want to understand the president, do 2 things. Number 1, start with his book. Read The Art of the Deal. It really tells you how he thinks strategically. Secondly, read his speeches. One of the most important speeches is the Warsaw speech, not accidentally presented at the site of the Warsaw uprising. I mean, it wasn't easy to get that site. We fought to get him to speak there. And that speech is very clear. American leadership is good for the world. The world is safer. The leading from behind of the Obama years was not good for anybody, whether you're the Ukraine, whether you're Syria, whether you're Egypt, not good for the world. So American leadership is good for all. And secondly, we are proud, and we will actually talk about our Judeo-Christian values as a nation, the values around which we were founded. And as such, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with any nation that has those values, be it Poland, be it Israel. And beyond that core group of countries that we see as allies, there are our partners. This is why the Asia trip of the president recently was so very, very important. You may not have the same cultural heritage, and you may not be technically allies with an Article 5 guarantee, but you are our friends and our partners. And there you may share not values with us necessarily across the gamut, but interests. And one of the key interests is, as you saw in the Asia meetings, making sure China doesn't rise militarily and in the meantime exploit and intimidate its neighbors in the region, and doesn't try through economic warfare to displace the Western model of free markets. So it's a tiered system, but in a very simple sentence, American leadership is back, and we are proud of what America stands for.
Let me turn to this Republican-released House Intelligence memo.
Yes.
Should the president, in your mind, fire Rod Rosenstein?
I've spoken to the president recently, and I have to recognize when it comes to these issues, he has taken a very hands-off approach. He may constitutionally be the chief law enforcement officer of America. It's not the attorney general. It's not the director of the FBI. It is the president. But he said, he's clearly, let them do what they do. I'm not going to insert myself on a day-to-day basis.
But he does insert himself.
Not on a day-to-day basis. He sends signals now and again publicly. He's done so with the AG, right? It's very interesting, sending signals to your AG publicly, who's a cabinet member. But on a day-to-day basis, he's not getting into the tactical issues. Should he fire him? Best scenario, I don't think the best scenario is the president fires him. He should be removed by the Attorney General, or he should resign. This is a man who is utterly flawed in terms of his capacity to objectively execute his mission as the Deputy Attorney General. This is a man who signed off on these FISA warrants, we now know, thanks to the memo, which were illegal. You cannot hide exculpatory evidence when you are applying for a warrant, whether it is a local sheriff applying for an arrest warrant, or whether it's a secret court that is providing the permission to spy on US nationals. And we now know that the DOJ and the FBI knew that this so-called Steele dossier was opposition research paid for by the Democrat Party, paid for by Hillary Clinton, and they hid this from the judge.
But does the fact that it began
at the bottom line is Rosenstein signed off on those requests for the FISA warrants.
And he was appointed by President Trump. But does the fact that this began under a conservative Republican organization bear any merit in terms of what Christopher Steele was able to come up with?
I don't think so. The bottom line stays the same. I mean, the idea of who was working with Fusion GPS in the beginning is irrelevant. The dossier did not exist until those $12 million landed from the DNC and Hillary Clinton's lawyer in Steele's bank account. So the fact is that the dossier's quality doesn't change. We now know the dossier was fabricated, and the two most important sources for that dossier were Russian propaganda sources. So you're talking about a completely fallacious set of non-evidence used to obtain a warrant from the FISA court at the time that those requesting the warrant knew that this was opposition research. Look, that may happen in other countries, in banana republics, but we don't do that in America. I had a chief of police text me when the memo blew, when it was declassified, and he said if any one of his officers had hidden exculpatory information on any warrant, he would have had him charged with perjury, obstruction of justice, or abuse of power. That's just for a regular county-level law enforcement officer. This is much more serious. Why? Because this is the secret FISA court. There is a very good reason why, when this country was created, and for the next 240 years, we never created a domestic security service. There's no MI5 in America. After 9/11, there was much talk that we need to have a federal agency to spy on Americans. It was shot down, even after 9/11. We don't like the idea of politicized law enforcement. What do we now know? Under the Obama administration, law enforcement, the intelligence community, was politicized. To attack an opposition candidate in a presidential campaign, that's very, very serious.
Should the Democratic memo be released?
Absolutely. Now, look, with one caveat. The only reason you shouldn't release documents related to the intelligence community is if they endanger current operations and uncover sources and methods. The embarrassing thing for the DNC, Adam Schiff included, and Nancy Pelosi, is that they said for 72 hours that the Nunes memo was full of sources and methods and would be dangerous to release. Well, all Americans have read it now. There are no sources and methods in there. There's nothing that endangers current operations. It was simply embarrassing to the FBI and to the DOJ under Obama. If there are no sources and methods in the Democrat memo, if it is fact-based and if it doesn't endanger operations, absolutely let the American people decide.
Our guest is Sebastian Gorka. Let's get to your phone calls. Bob is joining us from Illinois, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Two things, please. First, an observation, then a suggestion. Mr. Gorka, it's an honor to speak to you, sir.
Thank you.
Imagine what this country would be like if Mueller would lift the investigation, come out and say there is nothing to the Russians. The country's doing so well. Imagine if that cloud were lifted, how well the country would be doing. And then secondly, I'd like to suggest every conservative Republican nationwide, whenever they start a discussion regarding the Russian interference in the election in 2016, they start out on a defense with the question, whoever poses them. I think they should begin by reminding whoever they're conversing with that it was President Obama for 7 years and 9 months prior to the November 8th election that let Putin get away with what he got away with. And then once Trump became president, he had nothing to do with the election. He could possibly be blamed for it. He couldn't have interfered with it. He was only in there for 3 months from November 8th to January 20th. And so I think Obama owns it. And if all the Republicans would constantly remind their opponents, that would be a great thing. Thank you, sir.
Bob, thank you, from Illinois.
I'm a great proponent of letting this investigation end in its natural fashion. Why? Because the president, I remember one day, it was just the president and I in the Oval Office. It doesn't happen very frequently that there's just two of you. And I think Jared had just given his press conference on his testimony on the Hill. And the president looked at me and said, they will find nothing because there is nothing. I mean, it's very irritating to him because he knows there is no Russian collusion. If there's anybody who has issues with collusion, it's of course the DNC, whether it's Hillary colluding to steal the delegations, the superdelegates from Bernie Sanders, or whether it's the Fusion GPS. So, let's have a clean bill of health come out of the investigation. But to the caller's Bob's second point, again, Russian collusion, look at the last 12 months. Look at every policy that's come out of the White House. None of them are good for Vladimir Putin. Whether it's Anwar, whether it's fracking, whether it's NATO, whether it's arming the Ukrainian government. If there was any connection of a positive nature between Moscow and President Trump, would we not have seen the reverse for the last 12 months? It's an absurd accusation because this president understands who Vladimir Putin is and he understands the threat that Russia poses, not as a global threat, but to the region, especially of Central and Eastern Europe and to our NATO allies. So yes, the facts tell you everything you need to know about the absurdity of these accusations.
And again, this tweet from the president upon the release of that Republican House Intelligence Committee memo, and the president saying that the memo totally vindicates Trump in the probe, but the Russian witch hunt goes on and on. There was no collusion, there was no obstruction, and the word now, because of 1 year of looking into this and finding nothing, collusion is dead. This is an American disgrace.
I think the politicization of intelligence is a disgrace. The idea that you have a team of this nature. I mean, look who Bob Mueller hired. This is not. If I had been Bob Mueller, I mean, I've worked closely with the FBI for many years with the CT division, the counterterrorism division. I would have staffed this team with people as far away from the swamp as possible. I would have gone to the field offices in the Midwest, out on the West Coast, and brought people here who could not be tainted in any way, shape, or form with potential for political bias. What do we find? Exactly the opposite. Almost every member of the team is either connected with the left, donated to the left, or in some cases were lawyers for the Clinton Foundation. Justice must not just be done, it must be seen to be done. And as a result, the whole premise of this investigation is flawed, but its execution is also fatally flawed.
We'll go to Michigan next on the Democrats line. Henry, good morning.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to try and establish some ground rules. I'd like to be allowed to make my comments without interruption by Sebastian, because these clever right-wingers, they have a way of interrupting you. So
I think Steve's in charge.
Make your point.
Go ahead, Henry.
And if I am interrupted, I'd like to be able to rebut and not be cut off. First of all, I'd like to say that, the elections in 2018 are perhaps the most consequential in our history, because we have to stop an impending dictatorship by this white supremacist, right-wing traitor. And Donald Trump, make no mistake, is a traitor, along with everybody in his orbit.
Henry, why do you say he's a traitor?
Okay, I'm glad you asked me that question. We have to look at his relationship with the Russians. Donald Trump is owned by the Russian oligarchs because they are the ones who funded him when U.S. banks wouldn't. They have compromising information on him. We talk about the dossier. Well, what nobody is saying is that the dossier has been 80% has been proven to be legitimate, and 20% has been yet to be proven but has not been disproven.
Again, 2018 will be a very, very consequential election. I'm saddened by people who live in an alternate universe who use words such as dictator, white supremacist, and traitor. That's inflammatory and that's dangerous language. I can tell you as a person who's worked for the president in the West Wing, he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. The one thing that came through to me most clearly from working for him is that he doesn't care who you voted for. He doesn't care whether you voted for Hillary. He doesn't care whether you wanted Bernie to win. He doesn't care if you sat at home in November and didn't vote at all. He wants two things for you. He wants you to be safe, and he wants you and your family to prosper. That's who President Trump is. The Steele dossier, 80% is proven. How do you mathematically prove the contents of a completely propagandized information operation as true in any way, shape, or form? I'll just quote one line from an FBI senior employee that is in the Nunes memo. We know that Steele and Orr were individuals who were desperate to make sure President Trump didn't become president. That's all you need to know about the veracity of this dossier. There was an agenda, and the agenda was paid for by the DNC and Hillary Clinton to the tune of more than $12 million. We do not use opposition research as the background for secret spying warrants in America. At least we shouldn't.
As you know, the Senate Intelligence Committee also looking into all of this, and two very different approaches between the House and the Senate. What are your observations about what the Senate Committee is doing?
Look, I'm not privy to what the Senate is doing. I hope they stick to what Devin Nunes is doing, because I can tell you, because members of the team are friends of mine, the Nunes team was incredibly thorough. They went through hundreds of thousands of pages of classified material, and they spent months and months and months. And when they got to the end of it, what did they do? They completely followed the protocols of what is required. They summarized it. They made sure nothing would reveal anything sensitive to national security. Then it went to the White House for the president's veto on release. He allowed it to be released. I want to see that kind of judicious thoroughness coming out of the Senate as well. We shall see.
We'll go to Peter joining us from Provincetown, Massachusetts, Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to change gears here for a moment and go back to the fact that, a year ago, that is in January of 2017, just as President Trump was about to be inaugurated, there were reports that you could not share sensitive information with this president because he was too willing and too eager to share sensitive information, classified information with the Russians. Then we flip to May of this year. For the first time in American history, an American president invites Russians into the Oval Office without any other American president. No one to make a record of the meeting, no one to record the meeting, and he has them in there joking, and he's jovial, and he shares lots of information with the Russians again. We know that Lavrov came out of that meeting with something very sensitive, something that was deemed a coup by Russian intelligence, and Lavrov was on the horn in an instant to Moscow to say that that meeting had been very productive and that Trump had shared things with the Russians that should never have been shared.
Let me stop you on that point. You were at the White House during that time. What happened?
I was not in the room. This individual seems to know more than anybody else who was in the room, so I'm very impressed with Peter's capacity to spy on a private meeting by the president. Again, let's just get rid of the garbage fake news. Let's get rid of the hearsay. What are the facts? Judge the administration by what it has done, whether it's on the economy. Look at what's happened to this economy that's booming right now, whether it's on national security. Let's look at Russia. What has this administration done with regards to Russia in the last year? Russia is a one-resource, so one pony town. It runs on oil and gas. With the release of access to ANWR, with the release of fracking, with the XL pipeline, we have made Russia's capacity to exercise its energy stranglehold in general, not just regionally, much, much, much more difficult. With the revitalization of NATO, the commitment for them to actually spend what it takes to provide for their own security as well as for us to secure them as well. Likewise, sends a clear message to Russia, do not mess with this alliance. And then lastly, the arming of the Ukrainians is the most anti-Russian measure that we could take short of declaring war with Russia. So what are we talking about? Hyperbole, hearsay, fake news, or the facts on the ground? The bottom line is, I'll quote the president in his last press conference, I believe it was, in Trump Tower before he took over. Somebody shouted to him about, what about Vladimir Putin? What about Moscow? The president gave the best two-sentence summary of his attitudes to the Kremlin. In theory, I would like to have better relations with Russia. Right now, it doesn't look as if that's possible. And then he finished by saying, so be it. The president is a patriot, but he's also a pragmatist. This is a geostrategic country with 11 time zones. It's an important country. Can we be friends with it? Doesn't look like it. Is that a problem? Perhaps, but that's the reality. He looks at the world as it is, not through some ideological lens. Compare that to the last 8 years. Bending over backwards. Who took a reset button to Moscow? It wasn't Rex Tillerson. It was Hillary Clinton. Who did nothing, absolutely nothing, when Ukraine, a sovereign nation on the border with a NATO nation, Poland. Who did nothing? Wasn't President Trump. It was President Obama. Again, a man should be judged by his actions, not his words alone. Compare Russia's relationship to the Obama administration and to the Trump administration. And one last kill shot, if you will, to this theory of Russian collusion.
Our guest go ahead.
Which president, in a hot mic moment, said to Medvedev, the puppet of President Putin, don't worry, after the elections, I will have much greater flexibility. It wasn't Donald J. Trump, it was President Obama. That's all you need to know.
I just want to mention that our guest, Sebastian Gorka, former advisor to President Trump and now a Fox News contributor in our building often. We are glad that he's here on the 6th floor of 400 North Capitol. Dave from McKinleyville, California, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN, and thanks for taking my call.
Certainly.
I think I understand this correctly. The FBI used a dossier that had been financed by the Clinton campaign to convince the FISA court to authorize them to spy on the Trump campaign without disclosing that the dossier had been paid for by the Clinton campaign, or that the man who compiled it, a former British intelligence officer named Christopher Steele, had openly stated that he was willing to do anything he could to stop Trump from getting elected. Now, if that's true, the FBI was essentially a political weapon. And I'm reminded of Lois Lerner repeatedly taking the Fifth Amendment in her testimony before Congress regarding the targeting of conservative groups by the IRS. And I'm just wondering how many government agencies or departments have been turned into political weapons against Republicans, you know?
Thank you, Dave. We'll get a response.
I hope you post this show on the internet, because I think Dave's summary of the significance of that memo in one sentence was absolutely spot on.
It is on the web at cspan.org.
Good. I know the last time it was. Absolutely. I mean, this is not a one-off. This is the problem. If it's a one-off, then these people have to go. It's just Rod Rosenstein, Bruce Orr, Andy McCabe, those listed. They need to be investigated and suspended, not put into the HR department of the FBI. But it's not a one-off. It's as the gentleman said. It's the IRA. It's the IRS. It's the CIA. It's the DOJ. The DOJ was one of the most politicized departments under the Obama administration, especially the Civil Rights Bureau. So completely stand by that assessment. It is a perversion of what it means to have power. These agencies are not there to attack people you disagree with politically. But we will find out. I think, as Sarah Carter, the excellent Sarah Carter, has said several times on TV in the last week, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is but 10% of what we know just about abuses of power at the FBI. So I think 2018 will be a very interesting year, Steve.
What are your current projects?
So I'm doing a series of national security lectures for the Heritage Foundation across the country. And then I have to finish my second book. My publisher's waiting, Defeating Jihad, did very well. And now I have a book planned for later this year called Why We Fight. Stories of American heroes, the enemies they defeated, and what are the common connective links in terms of values between those fights, those battles, whether it was the Barbary pirates 200 years ago, whether it was the Vietnam War, or whether it is the jihadis today. So kind of illustrative demonstration of why we fight.
Speaking of books, have you read Michael Wolff's book?
I will not spend a red cent on Michael Wolff's book, and I won't download anything from WikiLeaks either. I understand they put the whole PDF online. I've read the long excerpt, the longest excerpt that was, I think, in the New York Magazine. I met Michael Wolff in the West Wing. I knew within a nanosecond this is not a man to be trusted. So I refused to give him any of my time, and I will not allow him to exploit my checkbook either.
Why did he have such access?
That's a good question. I don't know who approved his access to the White House. There's lots of theories out there. I haven't seen the paper trail. It's a good question because if you look at the previous book he published, not only was it generally badly received, 13 individuals quoted in that book by Michael Wolff demanded he retract the quotes because they did not reflect reality. And now we know exactly the same thing has happened with Fire and Fury, none other than Tony Blair, not exactly an arch-conservative. Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, as soon as the book came out, denied ever saying anything of the sort to Michael Wolff as he quotes him in the book. So it's just a charlatan's work.
We'll go to Tim, Toledo, Ohio, Democrats line with Sebastian Gorka. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
We're fine, thank you.
Good.
I just have the comment to say that I really try to look at things like logically and not emotionally. But with the Trump thing, it's real easy to figure out whatever he's accusing somebody else of doing, that's what he's doing. I've dealt with people that do that kind of stuff. You bring some charges up against them, they bring up total false charges against you to fight back. I mean, that's the kind of personality, that's the type of president we have right now. He will lie, cheat, steal, it doesn't matter. He believes the ends justify the means, and he does scare the hell out of me. And as far as the Fox News go, come on, man. I mean, talk about something that puts out totally spin, fake news. Fox News owns that category. I watch it just because it's comical. My mom used to watch it till she couldn't stand it more than had to turn it off. It's just what the world's come to is like a us and down that people can't realize. And the biggest thing with minority and all this other stuff, and everybody seems to want to play the victim and it's somebody else's fault, the reason my life is the way it is, instead of saying, I'm responsible for my life, it's the way it is.
Tim, thank you. We'll get a response.
I think it's a great rule of thumb for understanding the left, especially the progressive left, that they do project what they accuse others of is exactly what they're doing. The president has been proved right again and again and again. Remember, 11 months ago, what did he say? I was spied upon. The Trump campaign was spied upon. He was ridiculed by the likes of CNN. I'm sure this caller, Tim, likes CNN. And what do we now know? He was spied upon. His campaign was spied upon with an illegal warrant. So it's the opposite of what this caller said. And if the other broadcast networks were so truthful. I wonder why, for example, CNN gets less than 700,000 viewers on a good night. This is a nation of 320 million people. Who wins the ratings of the commercial networks every week? It's not CNN, it's not MSNBC, it is Fox with more than 4 million viewers per show. That tells you who's closer to the truth.
Let me ask you about the vice president. He's going to be in South Korea, the opening games of the Winter Games, and we've been hearing that he's also wants to send a strong message to North Korea. What is that message, and do you have any concerns about the pending games in terms of security?
I think there's such a spotlight on those games that I think, knowing the seriousness of the South Korean regime, they will be secured very seriously. In terms of message, it will be exactly the same message that the president and the vice president have been taking around the world in their recent visits, that this country, its administration, will call out evil where it sees it. This is literally a Stalinist regime. It is more Stalinistic than Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. This is a regime that starves its own people to build ballistic missiles and to fund a nuclear weapons program. So again, it will be a jettisoning of the moral relativism of the last 8 years and a reassertion that these regimes must not be given into. It will be Munich in 1938 again, a very simple message that we do not appease dictatorships, whether they're in Europe or they're in Asia. And perhaps lastly, I know that the foreign policy advisor to the president, I hope there will be a signaling again to Beijing that Beijing is in the cat seat. If we wish to deal with this problem in a way that is non-confrontational, non-military, the people best able to do so are China, because 85% of everything North Korea needs to survive comes from China. If they wish to stabilize the Korean Peninsula, it is through Beijing. So I'm sure there will be a message for the Politburo in China as well.
Final question. You came to the U.S. when?
I moved here 10 years ago this year, 2008.
Sebastian Gorka, former advisor to President Trump, part of the national security team, now with the